Welcome back to Cream City Social, my friends. You are strapped in for part 2 of our 3-part series with Eric Rorholm on how elections have become an industry in this country, where we're talking through how money affects our politics, all the way from the candidates that decide to run for office to the ads that we see on TV. So if you haven't listened to part 1, please stop, hit pause, go back and listen to it. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And our conversation today is going to hold a lot more context for you if you do. But to quickly recap what we talked about last time, it was in 2010, Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that I think we all are kind of vaguely familiar with, went through and allowed a lot of untraceable money to come into our politics, and how that new money is affecting how political parties operate, fundraise, and ultimately decide to make policy that affects all of us. And so today we're building on that knowledge, where we're going to find out where all that new money in politics is going, who's taking it, and what are they spending it on. And Eric does a great job of bringing it back local to Milwaukee and Wisconsin as a whole, and telling us how that money is playing out in our local elections. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. And like last time, I'm going to plug Sam Harshner and Missy Zombor's campaigns again. They can use all the help that you can give. Missy's running for school board in a citywide race, so she's got to cover this whole city. And Sam is running for the village board of Shorewood. So please check out their links below and find out how you can get involved. And with that, we'll keep it short and roll right into the interview. Here is a very honest conversation with someone making positive change in Milwaukee. Okay, so then the next question that jumps in my mind is, politics wasn't great before 2010.
Yeah.
Are we just watching something get way worse?
You, Will, are brilliant, because that is actually a fabulous pivot to Section 2 here, which is the construction of these political machines. How did we get from a place, like what are the physical institutions that are spending this money, right? Who is taking the money? Who are they spending it on? Why? How did that happen? What's the history? This is history that I'm not going to litigate the entirety of on here with the Clinton White House. But the Clinton presidency and its great orientation towards, by great I mean large, not good. Its reorientation from sort of the New Deal coalition to full-throated neoliberalism meant that the Democrat Party, sort of in the 80s, but especially under Clinton leadership, pivoted away from organized labor and towards big business. That was a titanic shift for so many reasons in the United States, but pragmatically, imagine that you are Democrat Party fundraisers. You are now feeding out of the trough of the same trough as the Republicans. This created a fundamental issue. You still had labor mostly contributing to Democrats, granted in increasingly diminishing numbers, with that money going less and less far every year. But now you had Democrats and Republicans both having to take from the same pools of money. This created lots and lots of issues. This ultimately, you will recall the Democrats, well, I would argue the Democrats won in 2000, and that the first election that was stolen was stolen by a Bush and a Cheney. So I personally don't want to hear anything from Liz Cheney or the January 6th committee. Anyhow, Al Gore was not seated as president of the United States, and Democrats again find themselves out of power. 2006 becomes a really pivotal year. Because this is the year that the Bush and the Republican fortune has kind of started to plummet. Pundits are seeing a Democratic wave coming in the future.
Is this his approval ratings going down and the whole administration just?
Yeah, this is around the time the Iraq War and
started going
I
belly
think
up. Yeah,
around this time, I think there's starting to be origins of economic unrest, but that, of course, doesn't really totally hit the fan until 2008. The party needs to start getting ready for the midterm elections. Ha ha ha. This strategy is largely overseen by a man who we are very familiar with on Lake Michigan, named Rahm Emanuel, Chicago's former mayor. Actually, Biden tried to nominate him as an ambassador, and his nomination, I believe, was defeated with great controversy. Rahm Emanuel sort of gives birth to the idea of the Democrats that we think of today. Rahm Emanuel has this very high risk, high reward strategy where he is very deliberate on recruiting candidates of a very specific ideology. Because the Democrats have pivoted towards a neoliberal orientation and are now running as a capitalist party and wanting the support of big business.
Because they can no longer get the support from labor, they now need to get it from corporations, and so they're forced.
And this is their strategy
to find this new people,
right? And this is their orientation, is that they can bring together big labor and big money in their heads, and ultimately get enough money to make it
best
over
of
the
both
finish
worlds,
line.
right? Yeah.
So the kinds of candidates that Rahm Emanuel prioritizes, and I don't know exactly the process by how he did it, but this is the era where the idea of the moderate Democrat being a staunch Wall Street capitalist and also vaguely liberal, maybe some level of socially progressive, maybe some level of fiscally conservative, but like a traditional neoliberal liberal. The idea of a moderate being someone who is fiscally right-wing and socially centrist, maybe. This is the idea where that comes from. These candidates romp in 2006. They flip seats in Idaho. They flip seats in Louisiana and Arkansas.
Oh, so it works.
It worked until 2010. Because there are lots of reasons why Democrats get romped in 2010. I mean, this is part of the political realignment that ultimately brings me towards socialism and towards DSA. But these candidates get absolutely killed. But these candidates and this direction of the party to be very economically right-wing has become a central bind. And this is in the year that Democrats are wiped out, is in the year 2010, the year that unlimited spending sort of comes back. So not all of these Democrats get killed. Some hold on, and that becomes important because they're sort of vestiges of this between this sort of Trumpy political partisanship, the House Freedom Caucus, that kind of partisanship that starts to flare up, and these Democrats thinking that they can somehow get it into a place of 50+1 with big money.
Their interests are aligned.
So these are specifically, these are people like Claire McCaskill, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, people who went on to lose their Senate races even in the quote unquote blue wave of 2018, all these Democrats who went on to lose just because they were catching up from weird trends from 2010 and 2012. But this is the era under these people, under these conditions, under the leadership of Rahm Emanuel, that you start to have the consolidation of what I would call the vestiges of big money that we have today. So I'm going to start reading from a piece here from, not from the American Prospect, from The Intercept. This is by Ryan Grimm, who I will cite a lot of his stuff today, and Rachel Cohen. So first, this is going to talk about a swing race in 2018 and use that sort of as a proxy because there's some funny details that I think there's some very typical Democrat behavior coming from this pack that I think you're going to see as intrinsic of behavior that would then continue. Okay. And then we'll talk about the history because this article goes all the way back. So this piece begins, in most industries, a failure, this is referring to an ultimate loss. In most industries, a failure that stark, or a stark failure, would lead to an autopsy, a round of firings, and a reformulation of strategy to make sure it doesn't happen again. The stakes are particularly high for 2020 midterms. Next time, the same miscalculations that could cost the party its thin majority, and with it, the ability for the Biden administration to legislate. So basically, overall, this piece is saying, like, capitalism, the idea is like, oh, well, if things aren't working, it's just going to naturally get more efficient. You'll fire people. If things don't work, like, the free market will naturally iron it out. But these institutions of big money don't function that way. Instead, the calamity led to promotions and expanded business opportunities for those at the top. In this specific story, Ryan takes Lucinda Grimm, the outgoing director of the DCCC. In 2019, Black and Hispanic lawmakers publicly criticized the DCCC term. That is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So this is I need to define that term. This is the House Democrats' arm for expanding and holding its majority. This is one of the core institutions that I really, really want to talk about. Is the DCCC and the DSCC. The DS on the Senate side, the DCCC on the House side. These are institutions that are nominally just there to raise money and help elect more Democrats. That is the only purpose. You'll notice it's very vague. This vagueness is exploited. The diversity-driven, they were, in 2019, Black Hispanic lawmakers criticized the DTRIP for lack of diversity. Okay, sure. Within days, the executive director and 5 other senior aides resigned, and Gwynn, who identifies as Latina, was brought in shortly after to be executive director. Diversity-driven shakeup left the team with little time to prepare. After disappointing results, Gwynn left and was named a top partner at a major consulting firm, Ralston Lapp, now Ralston Lapp Gwynn, which was founded by a former executive director of the DCCC. Her move to the firm will be a boon to the company that has long done millions of dollars in business with the House Democrats and the DCCC. This specifically, I didn't even quote the funniest part of this. So this specifically is talking about a race in a pretty geographically large district of Texas, number of which I'm not going to remember. It stretches just outside of El Paso, like all the way down to sort of southern Texas. It's a very geographically huge district. It was considered 50-50. Gina Ortiz-Jones, I believe was the candidate's name on the Democratic side. When she won the primary, the party tweeted, "The future is woman and female. Congratulations," which is hilarious because she was Filipina, not Latina. This was the piece that I was going to say earlier. It just screams of the problems that the Democratic Party has. What this piece is then echoing is there were criticisms from the inside that the DCCC was not accurately reflecting the diversity of the candidates with whom they needed to support. That point is sort of immediately undermined by them misidentifying a candidate on their own. This race, even though it was considered winnable, ultimately was lost. So this is, and a lot of races in 2018 and 2020 were like that. You might recall that even though Joe Biden won, actually Republicans gained 15 seats in the House of Representatives last year, and a number of seats that were not even listed in the frontline list of vulnerable seats ended up flipping red, which Joe Biden won, so that was not really recognized. But under the hood, there were flashing red lights that the D-Trip's ability and the party's ability to hold on to Congress were in danger. So this piece then lays out a little bit of the history of the formation. So in 2006, as they say, the DCCC, as I've mentioned before, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee was run by John Lapp. We used the name Lapp earlier when talking about this specific consulting firm. The DCCC was run by John Lapp and his deputy, Ali Ward, who is now Ali Lapp. Interesting. Executive Director John Lapp would go on to create the firm Ralston Lapp Media, now one of the major firms servicing the DCCC. As the DCCC chair, Rahm Emanuel, who I referred to before, recruited conservative, business-friendly veterans and managed to win back the House with the wrong strategy at the right time. In 2008, the DCCC was helmed by Brian Wolf, a Pelosi aide who had been a campaign director under Lapp during the previous cycle. When 2009 brought full Democrat control Washington, K Street was in need of Democrats with ties to party leadership, and he broke the typical DCC pattern by becoming a lobbyist at the Edison Electric Institute. Interesting, rather than a consultant. He currently sits on the board of the party's super PAC, the House Majority PAC. Interesting. 2010, for the 2010 midterms, the DCCC hired John Vogel as executive director. Vogel had been a DCCC deputy in 2006. In 2008,
I'm seeing a trend here.
Yes, you are. Had run the organization's $85 million independent expenditure in its first cycle in business. Ralston Lapp billed the DCCC and House Democrats running for re-election more than $3 million. Vogel hired Robbie Mook, who served as the top operative on Hillary Clinton's 2008 failed campaign. Over the past 2 cycles, DCCC House Majority PAC has spent roughly $1 million through this new MVAR company. Vogel was replaced in 2012 by Mook. Mook then went on to manage Terry McAuliffe's campaign for governor. This name comes up again. Terry McAuliffe has run for governor again, 2019, with the same people, and lost to a Republican. 2014.
Just think
top
how much
DCC.
money that is.
Yeah, no, seriously, a DCCC job
Like
finally went to a woman.
$30 million just flushed away.
Yep, Kelly Ward, now Kelly Ward Barton. There's a reason I'm going through this whole history right here. That gets us to the 2018 cycle. Democrats finally reclaimed the House. Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico took over as DCCC chair. To make sure there was finally a Latino-run firm doing business, they turned to Ernest Bromley. Bromley goes through some Puerto Rican stuff, retired from the firm, decided to get involved in politics, teamed up with Democratic Operative Laura Hernandez to create Pescador Public Strategies, goes on so far, so forth. Yeah, there's a lot of OC House Majority PAC also launched a 501c4 called House Majority Forward. So it just kind of infinitely spirals out of control from there. The more money that gets pumped into the system, you're starting to see these specific individuals who there is a personality pipeline going all the way back. There's a really sick revolving door between these institutions, which on paper seem fine. The DCCC, in theory, is funded by, we'll get here. The DCCC, in theory, is funded by all the Democrats in the House right now that pool together a certain number of dues that are all due at once, sort of like being in a union or in like a club, you know?
So this is the phone banking that they do, and then all that money from the phone banking
so
goes
yeah, actually,
to...
yeah, that is a perfect actual point. So you hear, you know, I don't know if a lot of people know this actually. Most members of Congress spend like at least 5 hours a day, like spend at least 20 hours a week just raising money. They are raising money typically for the DCCC. In theory, the DCCC is just made up of contributions of dues from these members. There's two problems. One, the DCCC, as you've seen here, has a crazy revolving door with literal big money super PACs and big money interests, like legitimate corporations and arms dealers, that prohibit it. That pressure of individuals who are involved say no to running ads about military or healthcare or environment or because there's conflicts of interest. But two, the members have to raise money since they owe money, quote unquote, especially the way Pelosi and Hoyer have been consistently needling members to give. These people are also under pressure to raise money from sketchy big money people in their own districts. And so it creates this system that's completely beholden to big money. The Democrats argue progressives are making this issue worse by not paying in. People like AOC, Ayanna Pressley, and also some frontliners who consider themselves moderate, like Abigail Spanberger, refuse to pay in.
I was going to say, what happens if you don't pay in? And why do they feel the pressure to pay in?
So nothing happens if you don't pay in. Here's why people don't pay in. There's a couple of reasons. One, I mean, just straight up, you're getting rid of your own campaign money to give to a central force. And if you're Abigail Spanberger or some frontline Democrat who is running, you know, as above the two-party system and you don't want to be tied as Pelosi, that's a problem.
Sure.
The DCCC also in 2020 instituted a blacklist where they blacklisted explicitly, and this is where shit really got off the rails. They explicitly banned any vendor who is or had ever contracted with anyone who was primarying a sitting Democrat. So I want you to think of the absurdity of that. That wasn't saying the D-Trip won't help you primary a Democrat. That was saying if you have ever helped anyone primary an existing Democrat, no part of the Democrat Party, at least the DCCC, will ever even do business with you. So that right there was an attempt to kill off the remaining, or more accurately, the firms that had sprung up around like AOC's race, an example, that weren't taking all this big money, these like small, scrappy designers and, you know, small consulting
just
firms.
Two or three people who got good at something. And
that was an attempt to crush that growing ecosystem. This is a problem, though, because the big money firms, as you've seen, suck at it. They make terrible ads that people hate. The best example, actually, of this, you'll remember the Lincoln Project from last year. It was a bunch of former Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans. Democrats loved him. Liz Cheney loved him, and she loved him back. There was actually, they put out a lot of commercials and had them poll tested. I can't remember how Crystal and Sagar from Breaking Points got a hold of the focus groups. The ads actually made people more likely to vote for Trump. Like the ads were, and you know how they were like that January 6th ad that we watched at the beginning. They were vague and full of platitudes and self-aggrandizing, and they used abstract terms like democracy and they didn't appeal to anyone. And in fact, if anything, they made people apprehensive of the Democrats. They legitimately made people not want to vote Democrat, but there was no accountability on that side. And the biggest reason why is a lot of big money Democrats were making a lot of money making those commercials at the end of the day.
And going back to what you said about squeezing out the little new guys in this ecosystem. So they put in a rule in place that anybody who helped some of these upstarts like AOC, primary, a sitting Democrat, said you can't get any money from the DCCC, any money from Democrats centrally if you work with them. And so that makes everybody not work with them, which makes these guys just kind of go away.
And so here's why the rule was BS. Theoretically, the rule was supposed to work both ways, so which also meant, no, you're not going to get any help at all, and we're going to ban anyone who helps primary people like AOC or Ilhan Omar.
Yeah.
Although Ilhan Omar's 2018 primary opponent, Anton Melton Moe, was using D-Trip-approved consultants and a firm, and no, they were not punished. There was not even so much as he lost. So Ilhan Omar held on, but no.
It's only people they want.
It was not, the rule was not evenly applied. The rule was legitimately only put in place in order to disincentivize progressives from, it was put in place to destroy the ecosystem and the infrastructure that was there to help progressives challenge establishment Democrats.
Because I wonder why there isn't more of that. It feels like there's a need for it, and it feels like young people are good at this.
Yeah.
And we should be doing this.
So that ban was reversed, thankfully, in 2021, because there was so much outrage just within the caucus about that. But this is one of the biggest issues, and this is why the big money in elections is such an issue, because for, as I articulated earlier, for every attempt there is to get savvy, to get organized, to out-organize the big money, there will always be more money to out-drown you. So this is part of why I also really do advocate for primary challenges and stuff like that, and why I was very supportive of lots of people primarying lots of existing Democrats, is because, one, I think primaries are extremely healthy and helpful, both for people who are voting in them and for the candidates. It helps candidates like actually build consensus and understand what their constituents want, but also because it helps to build that infrastructure that this was part of why I ran, right? To help build the infrastructure and the know-how, and to build a community of people who knew how to do this so that it would be easier next time and easier next time and easier next time. That's been our experience here, but
we're witnessing it.
Right. And, if you're running for Congress or, God forbid, U.S. Senate, I mean, it's an absolute nightmare. And so I want to hammer home the final point of like the actual institutions of big money is they are not good at this. They are bad at this. They are bad at winning elections. Like, the Democrat establishment is bad at running elections. They don't understand the American people. They are not good at winning. So, and they're not neutral players either. This is part of why I get so incensed about it, is the D-Trip will have a policy like that where they will explicitly try and ban anyone who tries to primary existing Democrats. They're not neutral in primaries. They endorse in primaries. They pick candidates. They pick favorites. And those favorites usually go on to lose. This was the most pronounced actually on the Senate side. In 2020, there were 4 states that came to mind that recruited candidates who did significantly worse than they should have. Those were Sarah Gideon in Maine defeated a progressive primary opponent named Betsy Sweet. I don't remember the opponent in North Carolina, but Cal Cunningham was one of them. Teresa Greenfield in Iowa beat a woman named Kimberly Polk and a couple of other people for the Iowa Senate race. And then John Hickenlooper beat Andrew Romanoff for the Senate seat in Colorado. Those first 3 women, all, even though they were projected to win in the polls, Sarah Gideon was projected to win by 10 points, went on to lose. Actually, Sarah Gideon lost by around 10 points, with millions still sitting in the bank, by the way. John Hickenlooper ultimately did win in the state of Colorado, but by like 3 points in a state that's pretty much Dem plus 10, I would argue, at this point. So these big money institutions are not just crushing candidates who care about the issues that we care about. But then they're also more likely to lose to Republicans. And this is really relevant.
That's really interesting.
Because a central issue that I and many people have identified this cycle, which is not to be personally shady, but Mandela Barnes's campaign manager, Corey Kozlowski, worked for the DCCC until this year. He comes with that culture and those connections.
That incentive
and
structure.
It is presumably, I don't know, I haven't done this research. It is presumably those people that are consulting the campaign. And it is presumably those same media firms in Chicago and DC, not in Madison or Milwaukee, that are making his ads. And I would wager you anything it's some out-of-state blowhard who told him to pull groceries out of a paper bag and talk about how cool the police and ICE are. Because that person does clearly not know a lot about Wisconsin or what people here care about. But it's not just a polemic moral issue. These things have legitimate, real-life ramifications for us.
And you
here.
see them in your life. Yeah.
No, seriously.
You were talking earlier about the ads that make you dislike the candidate. Mandela Barnes, I think, is one of those. I watch those ads and I'm like, I don't want to vote for you anymore, man.
I would simply argue so. Yeah, definitely. And this does go both ways, too. I mean, I think the Republicans are equally incompetent at this. They'll put an ad up on TV, too, that they'll think is nice. And I'll be like, that candidate looks like a schmuck. And Ron Johnson still, his favorability in this state has barely squeaked above 40%. Like, clearly he has this issue, too. This is a bipartisan issue. This is not an issue that is just screwing down Democrats. Both parties are phenomenally unpopular in this state and in this nation. This problem is, I would argue, the gasoline allowing the legitimacy crisis of democracy in this country to burn.
And this is coming from the money all being from that 1 or 5% of people. So it's from that culture, that subculture, that thought process, that way of living. And then it's coming through from our media because they're the ones who fund all the ads. And so we're seeing all of this. So Democrats and Republicans both can't do it because they're getting money from the same people. And so it's just a mirror image or two sides to the same coin.
I cannot even express the number of problems it causes at all levels, top and bottom. So like, let's take your question and give two examples, a top and a bottom. A top example would be where I would argue that an institution of big money, because it is beholden to big money, is unable to comment or talk about that issue. Ukraine is probably the best example. Whether you're a Democrat who is, really supportive of the spending that we're doing in Ukraine, or you are very apprehensive and think that we should be pursuing a path to diplomacy, you saw it in that article. The amount of military industrial complex spending, whether they're giving directly to the candidates and then giving to
Lockheed Martin
or whatever the process is, and that's just on the giving side. That's not even including the lobbying on the government side, because these people are both campaigners and politicians. They get talked in through both sides. So that would be an example of an issue. And healthcare is another really, really fabulous one where the amount of pressures on you just means that you functionally cannot touch that issue. You talk about single payer, you lose a ton of your money. You talk about the Affordable Care Act, you lose a whole lot of people on the other end. So that's a really good example. But it has perverse incentives on the other way too. So for example, it sounds like you're lucky enough to have been spared ever getting put on a DCCC email list, but they have a very particular, very clickbaity format. I don't know if you saw any of the memes about like Nancy Pelosi when she went to Taiwan, sending out the dramatic emails of my plane's about to be shot down over Taiwan, and if you don't donate, $7 right now, this could be the end for the West. The ads are crazy, like true boomer fuel, like insanity in the inbox, like 6 of them at a time, like 6 of them a day at least, nonsense clickbait, like flashing GIFs, like as if these are websites built in 2004.
It's like 90s, yeah.
Like just absolutely like butchered the ability for candidates to connect with their constituents. And Mark Buchan, for example, he must be contracting the same firm that's doing the emails that the D-Trip at least did before 2020 when I was still on the email box, because they're the same. They're structured functionally the same. So the existence and the proliferation of these firms doing what I would argue is a bad job, those firms continue to exist and then do a bad job for other candidates. So I would argue that the continuation of that system has now made Mark Pocan's email inbox, at least his fundraising emails that I used to get, awful. Right? So like these are examples of how bad administration of politics like literally trickles down to our level and helps fuel resentment of politics and campaigns overall. Does that make sense?
It does. And I was thinking, so these organizations keep surviving, going on, and feeding the next campaign.
Even if
there's no accountability,
lose.
Right?
Correct.
So if they lose, it just doesn't matter is it because there's nobody else to take their place? Or is it because the money is just going to go there because the connections of the people?
Both. The same people are constantly promoted and maintain positions in these orgs. So like that's part
there's
of
no
why
way
I
to
read
get
the
up
history.
there without going through
and
it
there's
all. Yeah,
there's a ton of attrition to K Street and then back, or into a board of a company and then back. So there's just functionally like a ton of turnover within, people talk about the Beltway in DC. Like it is a legitimate, very insular culture.
It's a network of people.
There are very few number of them that are interacting with each other. So
they do know each other.
They have a common set of skills. They have a common history. They have a lot in common. They've done things the same way for a very long time. And you know how that pressure manifests itself in offices and stuff. This is kind of an entire Congress, military, campaign, industrial complex or something, sort of. So to
very
speak.
human at the end of the day.
No, seriously. And so to give an example of that locally, again, not to be shady to our friends in our community, but local manifestations of this, the best manifestation that we have to really point to in Milwaukee and Wisconsin is Nation Consulting, is definitely the Wisconsin premier, big money consulting firm. And to the point earlier I made about them not being very good at it, this is not insulting or to be rude, but just as a matter of pragmatism, this year, Nation represented a number of candidates. They represent many of whom did not do well statewide. They represented Sarah Rodriguez, who was a lieutenant governor candidate. They represented Angelito Tenorio for state treasurer. They supported Alexius Zombor for Secretary of State and Alex Lastry for U.S. Senate. Alex Lastry, the billionaire, by the way, not from Wisconsin. None of those candidates won. In fact, Angelito in a three-way primary, Angelito's from Milwaukee, in a competitive three-way primary, he actually came in last behind a person who really did not campaign that much, Aaron Richardson. And as well as Jillian Bettino, who was endorsed by our Wisconsin Revolution, I should add. So that is just a data point in and of itself to point to the fact that just because they are drinking from the trough of big money does not mean
you're winning.
Yeah, it does not mean that you're winning, and it does not mean that they're good at it. I want to also add that firm represented Alex Brower's opponent in the school board race, Julie Gokul Gandhi, who then after election day did take a check from American Family Insurance PAC. So, right. So you have yourself an example of how big money is kind of churning even sort of at the local level.
How does that start? I don't want to throw shade too much or whatnot and gossip the hour away, but how does someone at Nation get started? How does Nation get started? Is that a person who interns in DC and then builds some connections and works out there for 10 years and then comes back and hires a buddy or something?
It's a good example, actually, because there are a lot of big names at Nation. Thad Nation is his name. It's named after him. Thad is there. I don't know what his position or title officially is. Sachin and Jason Ray are also big people there. Sachin does a lot of stuff also with the democracy campaign and gerrymandering, for example. Jason Ray is a DNC member, or now he's an honorary DNC member. He was a DNC member actually when he was very young. I met Jason a couple of years ago. He was a Marquette student actually and became part of the DNC when he was very, very, very young. Actually, fun fact, when I ran the Satellite Iowa caucus at Marquette, the Iowa Democratic Party had Jason Ray run the caucus instead of me. He did a great job. But I directly to the DNC. I mean, you can't, it's pretty hard to, he's a literal DNC fixture.
Are
if
you
that
a
answers
regular
that.
DNC fixture, Eric?
No. I met Jason because he came to our college Democrats meeting. I do not think Jason's a big fan of mine. Hi, if you're listening to this. Sorry if I'm
lunch.
wrong. No. But, these were lawyers. I mean, in a lot of cases, it's lawyers or media people, and that's a really good question because the way that these institutions are circumvented is in situations like where you have a person like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez primarying Joe Crowley, and you need pragmatically people on the ground to help you make an ad and make flyers and make that on the ground political know-how is so valuable for a democracy. And so the fact that the Democratic Party that runs and is running explicitly on a platform of vaguely democracy right now, while its big money institutions are actively, well, this will get us into our third section, while these big money institutions are actively attacking progressive members of Congress, because that'll get us into sort of the counter revolution that's sort of happening right now. But yeah, so I guess to sort of summarize where we're at so far, Citizens United allowing so much money to come in and so much unregulated money to come in really changed the landscape. And since super PACs just absolutely dominate messaging and spending right now, that's forced institutions like the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DSCC, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. On the state level, too, we have one, the ADCC, the Assembly Democratic Campaign Committee, and there's a state Senate one, too. These institutions have been forced to raise more money and to compete in a bigger money atmosphere, and that means the D-Trip has become functionally a big money front group. It means the DSCC has become functionally a big money front group, and the fundamental tension here is that Jill Stein said this remarkably well. I think this is the fundamental problem at the end of the day, is the Democrats are trying to be a progressive pro-democracy party while taking money from Wall Street and being a capitalist party, and it fundamentally can't be done. The institution that is supposed to help you win, since it is beholden to big money, cannot speak to the issues that you need to speak to win. So we're caught in this catch-22 of two unpopular parties that are taking money from the same people, or vaguely the same people,
funded by the same
slightly
people.
different versions of the same people in some cases. Like, got two different corporations,
two different
that cultures
cultures
slightly
of the
different
same
values
type of
or
people.
whatever. Yeah, but at the end of the day, you have this really grotesque big money system where the money is in the driver's seat, and I would argue starting a little bit in 2018, really starting last year, and then really continuing in 2022. You see the parties using those big money institutions to really try to shape the country and the parties in their image rather than just win.
Yeah, and to add one more part to the summary that you highlighted that I'd never thought about before, but that it is so individual contribution based, and that it is a very small select set of people, group of people, funding all of this, which trickles down to the way we experience it, the way the ads look, the way their messaging happens. Yeah, I thought it was corporations. I didn't realize it was very much a lot of individuals.
And here's the thing, it's both. Like, even if it's not,
at the end of the day, it is
if it's
both.
not Coca-Cola Incorporated,
But
it's it's the board,
the
it's
VP,
the chair of the board of
the-
directors, and 18 VPs. Like, thank you for bringing that up, because here's another good example of how this played out.
Yeah, exactly.
An example of how that exact point that you've articulated in the Democratic primary for the Pennsylvania Senate race. There were 3 people in that primary. I thought that was a very interesting race, by the way. Side note, I'm not sold on John Fetterman the way that a lot of progressive Democrats are. I find his position on a lot of things really problematic, and I don't think he maps neatly in a left-right spectrum either. So it's interesting. But there were 3 very interesting candidates in that primary. John Fetterman, who's a very interesting political brand. Malcolm Kenyatta, who I believe is a state legislator in the Philadelphia area, also a very interesting political person, in my opinion. And Connor Lamb, who's also a very interesting...
Just a lot of interesting going on.
Well, Malcolm Kenyatta he maps a lot more neatly as a progressive. He was a Green New Deal Medicare for All supporter. He's gay. He's a person of color. He and John Fetterman kind of sparred with each other over issues in a way that I thought was interesting. Connor Lamb, however, is like the DNC could have manufactured him in a lab. Like, he's like the Pete Buttigieg, Hillary Clinton, Kamala
Stretch and
Harris,
grow.
Hillary Clinton, like the most standard issue person you could have. And there was an accusation that he had been taking money from a bank. I'm not going to remember the name of the bank. And he was very vociferous on Twitter. I have not taken any money from a financial institution, but I am blessed to be supported by a number of employees of XYZ. And it was the entire vice presidential team had all given him max out donations of the bank at which he worked. So, like, sure, the
It's
corporation
not from the bank, but
the corporation might not be giving the amount of money. But yes, anyway.
that's a good way to say it. Yeah, exactly.
So there are lots of creative ways for big money to funnel money in lots of ways. And they're not just doing it by X corporation is giving to X person. They're being very creative about it. And, this is the really depressing thing about it is the left impulse to that kind of bad news is just organize. But, organize every person in America to give $4 and you're still not at 1.6 billion. Like, it's just fun.
And you're there for one race.
Functionally, there becomes a point where you can't out-organize the entire economy being weighted against you anymore. Hence, why we are here as democratic socialists, but yeah, and not as capitalist Democrats. But
so, Eric, what do we do? What does this counter-revolution look like?
Well, so that's a really good question, and I love the way that you phrased it, because the third section I've got here is sort of counter-revolution, and that was funny language for me.
So tune in next time for the final installment of this 3-part series, where we're going to find out why the Democrats are funding MAGA primary candidates, and ultimately, what the heck we're going to do about this big money in our politics. Eric's got some cool solutions. So until then, like always, take care of each other, and we'll talk to you next time.